They remembered her first by the sound she made when she laughed, a soft, unguarded note that rose above the polite murmurs of the room and died too late to be forgiven. In a season governed by silence, her laughter was a small rebellion, and rebellion, however charming, is never overlooked. It traveled beneath chandeliers heavy with wax and crystal, skimmed across the gilt frames of ancestral portraits, and settled unwelcome among the guests gathered for the musicale in Mayfair that evening. She had been invited because she was harmless. That was the unspoken judgment passed upon her when her name appeared on the card list. Well born enough to be admitted, poor enough to be ignored. Her gown, carefully altered and pressed, bore the quiet scars of economy. Its silk had known another year, another owner. Yet she wore it with a composure that suggested neither apology nor defiance, only a practiced determination to endure the room as it was given to her. The younger son of the ducal house noticed her almost at once. He was handsome in the effortless way of men who have never been required to account for their charm, and he approached her with an ease that invited confidence. She responded as though conversation were a pleasure rather than a peril. Her wit, sharpened by necessity, met his lightness without strain. She smiled too readily, spoke too freely, and in doing so crossed an invisible boundary that every woman of the season was taught to sense without instruction. Across the room, the Duke watched. He did not move toward her, nor did he turn away. He stood where custom placed him, near the hearth, engaged in discourse that required none of his attention. As head of his family, he was expected to observe rather than participate, to weigh rather than indulge. His life had been shaped by ledgers and lineages, by the quiet tyranny of entailments that dictated not only his inheritance but his affections. What he felt, therefore, came to him as an intrusion, unwelcome and undeniable. He saw how she angled her body toward his brother, how her eyes brightened at some remark too foolish to deserve them. He observed the slight delay with which she withdrew her hand when it was released. None of it was improper enough to warrant censure, yet together it formed a picture that unsettled him more deeply than open transgression might have done. It suggested choice. It suggested ease. It suggested a world in which men like his brother could offer attention without consequence, and women like her could mistake it for safety. The room, sensitive as a living creature, felt the shift before it was named. Conversations altered their course, glances lengthened, then slid away. A lady of impeccable connections raised her fan a fraction too high, concealing a smile that was not unkind, merely amused. Another guest leaned toward her neighbor and murmured something that traveled faster than discretion. The heroine felt it then, the tightening of air that signaled she had been seen too clearly. She did not know the Duke was watching her. She knew only that the pleasure of the exchange had dimmed, replaced by an awareness she could neither explain nor dispel. When she laughed again, it was quieter, as though she were already retreating from herself. The younger son continued, oblivious, encouraged by what he mistook for favor. He had never been taught to recognize the moment when admiration becomes a liability. The Duke's anger did not announce itself as fury. It arrived as a precise, narrowing clarity. He understood, with a suddenness that startled him, how easily her reputation could be bent into a cautionary tale, how swiftly her cleverness could be recast as calculation. He also understood his own position in the tableau, the man with the power to interrupt, to protect, to destroy, and the obligation to do none of these things lightly. His brother's laughter reached him, careless and bright, and it struck him as an offense. Music filled the room again, the pianist called back to the instrument, the audience coaxed into applause. The moment passed, as moments always do, leaving behind only its consequences. She withdrew to the edge of the gathering, her composure restored at a cost she did not name. The Duke remained where he was, his expression unaltered, his resolve quietly forming. When the last note faded and guests began to rearrange themselves for supper, he moved at last, not toward her, but in such a way that escape became impossible. She felt his presence before she saw him, a shift in the air, a gravity she had not anticipated. He inclined his head, impeccable, unreadable, and spoke her name as though it were already a matter of record. There was no accusation in his manner, no warmth either, only an attention so complete it seemed to strip the room of its protections. She met his gaze and, for the first time that evening, understood that what she had thought harmless had been observed, measured, and found wanting. Around them, The season resumed its practiced indifference, unaware that something essential had altered its course. In the space between one breath and the next, before any word could be taken back, the Duke decided that this would not end as such things usually did. He would not allow her to be the lesson whispered over tea, nor his brother the instrument of it. The choice was dangerous, perhaps unwise, and wholly inevitable. He offered his arm, a gesture that promised nothing and threatened everything, and waited for her to decide whether she would accept it. She hesitated, sensing that the evening had shifted beyond recovery, that whatever followed would not be easily undone. The candles burned lower, the walls listened, and history, patient and unsentimental, inclined its head to watch two lives approach a threshold neither had intended to cross. Outside, carriages waited, and London breathed, indifferent to the quiet beginning. By the following morning, London had already begun its quiet work upon her name. It was not spoken loudly, nor written, nor condemned outright, but carried gently from breakfast table to carriage seat, shaped into something lighter than accusation and sharper than fact. She felt it in the altered warmth of invitations, in pauses that lingered a breath too long. Nothing had happened, yet something had been decided, and she walked through her day with a peculiar weight of being discussed by people who would never address her directly. Flowers arrived before noon, delivered with a formality that startled her maid into silence. They were white, severe in their abundance, arranged with a discipline that spoke not of flirtation but of command. No card accompanied them, yet their origin was unmistakable. She understood at once that they were not sent to please her but to be seen, a signal placed upon her threshold for others to observe. Gratitude tangled with unease as she thanked the footman and dismissed him. By afternoon, the younger brother called, buoyant and untroubled, as though the world existed solely to reward his attentions. He spoke of the musicale with fond exaggeration, unaware of its consequences, and suggested another engagement with an optimism that presumed her compliance. She listened, courteous and careful, sensing that acceptance would deepen the impression already forming around her, while refusal might wound him without saving herself. His charm, once disarming, now seemed careless. That evening, at a crowded assembly, the flowers appeared again, this time as murmured confirmation. She noticed eyes flicker toward her, then away, cataloguing the message she had not written. The Duke was present, composed as ever, acknowledging acquaintances with a restraint that bordered on coldness. He did not approach her, yet his influence was unmistakable. A chair was placed where she might sit. A conversation shifted to include her. These gestures, subtle and undeniable, altered her standing without explaining it. She realized then that protection carried its own dangers. The Duke's intervention, though invisible, tethered her more securely to his notice than any open declaration could have done. Society, which thrived on inference, began to construct its own narrative, one in which she was no longer harmless. She felt her dignity balanced upon the edge of rumor, preserved for the moment by a hand she had not invited. A single remark tipped the evening toward scandal. Spoken lightly, almost kindly, it suggested ambition where she claimed only survival. Laughter followed, not cruel, merely relieved to find a shape for its curiosity. She responded with composure learned too early, but the sound reached the Duke across the room like a challenge. He crossed to her then, his expression measured, and addressed her with a courtesy so precise it silenced the surrounding murmur. He offered her his arm again, this time without ambiguity, and escorted her from the room under the guise of refreshment. No one protested. No one needed to. The gesture rewrote the evening more efficiently than defense ever could. In the quiet of an adjoining drawing-room, he released her and regarded her as though weighing a consequence he had already accepted. "I will not have you made a spectacle," he said, his voice low and even. It was not an apology, nor a promise, but a statement of intent. She answered with the truth she could afford, thanking him without yielding, acknowledging his aid without inviting its continuation. The distance between them narrowed, charged with restraint. When they returned, the assembly adjusted once more, accommodating the new understanding. The younger brother noticed at last, confusion clouding his ease, but said nothing. As the evening ended, and carriages were called, the Duke bowed to her with formal exactness, leaving behind the certainty that what had begun as rumor had now acquired a keeper. She rode home beneath a sky blurred by soot and mist, her reflection wavering in the carriage glass like a question she could not yet answer. The evening replayed itself with cruel precision. The flowers, the laughter, the Duke's measured gaze. She wondered what price accompanied such guardianship, and whether refusal was still possible. Poverty had taught her the cost of pride, yet pride was all she possessed. To accept his protection was to invite a narrative she did not control, and to reject it was to stand alone before a society eager for misstep. Elsewhere in the city, the Duke remained awake long after custom allowed. He considered the balance he had disturbed, the ease with which power moved when guided by will rather than habit. He told himself that restraint had governed him, that he had merely corrected an imbalance, yet the memory of her composure troubled him more than her laughter had done. He recognized, with unwelcome clarity, that he had crossed a boundary his rank could not excuse. Intervention invited expectation, and expectation, once formed, demanded fulfillment. He foresaw the cost and did not retreat from it. The following day promised no relief. Invitations arrived altered, cautious, phrased to observe rather than to welcome. The younger brother sent a note of puzzled civility, its tone already constrained by rumor. She replied with care, guarding his feelings while disentangling herself from his assumptions. Each word felt weighted, as though her future might hinge upon an inflection. By evening, she understood that neutrality was no longer available to her. She had been placed, however gently, upon a board where others moved the pieces. Thus the season advanced, untroubled by conscience, satisfied with its quiet rearrangements. She stood within it altered, no longer invisible, not yet claimed. The Duke's presence lingered at the edge of her days, a promise and a warning entwined. Whatever followed would demand courage from them both, and sacrifice from at least one. As London watched, patient and exacting, the question was no longer whether scandal would come, but who would decide its shape. The night closed without answers, leaving intention suspended between duty and desire for now. The Duke requested her presence not by letter but by absence, withdrawing the quiet protections that had steadied her days and leaving her to feel the sudden chill of exposure. She understood the summons at once, and accepted it with the composure expected of a woman long accustomed to consequences she had not chosen. They met in a small morning room at his London residence, where the light fell gently through tall windows and softened even the severity of his rank. No fire burned, though the air held the memory of one, and the restraint of the space felt deliberate. He did not offer his arm, nor did he sit, remaining standing as though unsure whether the conversation deserved ceremony. She waited for him to speak, aware that patience was her only advantage. When he began, his voice was measured, stripped of the softness she had imagined and replaced by an honesty that unsettled them both. He spoke of duty without embellishment, of estates bound by law, of alliances forged to preserve a name that would outlive his inclinations. He acknowledged his brother's freedom, not with bitterness but with clarity, and named the danger of mistaking attention for intent. Then he spoke of her, carefully, as though each word might bruise. He told her that society forgave men their amusements and punished women their hopes, and that he would not pretend otherwise. She listened without interruption, her hands folded, her expression steady, though her heart pressed hard against its discipline. When he finished, the silence between them carried more weight than his speech. She answered him with a candor born of necessity, admitting her poverty, her awareness of risk, and her refusal to be shamed for seeking kindness. She said she had not intended to provoke envy or protection, only to survive the season with her dignity intact. If his aid endangered her further, she would relinquish it, regardless of cost. The admission struck him more forcefully than reproach. He had expected gratitude or defiance, not resolve so quiet it bordered on surrender. He confessed then, not of love, but of recognition, of a pull he could neither justify nor dismiss. He told her that when he had said she chose the wrong man, he had been speaking as much to himself as to her. The confession altered the room, stripping it of formality and leaving only the truth of two lives intersecting at an inopportune moment. She felt the weight of his position then, not as power but as confinement, a gilded enclosure that demanded obedience. In acknowledging it, she found her own resolve harden rather than yield. She told him she would not be the reason he betrayed his obligations, nor the consolation that made them bearable. If there was to be a choice, it must be made with clarity, not impulse. Her words left him without refuge, confronting him with the cost of hesitation. For the first time, he saw that restraint could be as cruel as indulgence. He did not ask her to wait, nor did he promise resolution, offering only the truth of his intent to act rather than hover. She accepted this with a nod that carried equal parts hope and farewell. When they parted, the morning light had shifted, and the room seemed to exhale. She stepped back into the city knowing that whatever followed would be deliberate. He remained behind, conscious that confession, once spoken, could not be reclaimed. Outside, the season continued its rituals, unaware that a quiet reckoning had occurred beyond its gaze. Both understood that the next movement would demand courage rather than patience. For her, courage meant risking solitude in favor of self-respect, a choice she had made before and would make again. For him, it meant reshaping a life defined by inheritance into one guided by intention. Neither spoke of love, yet its absence from their words made its presence unmistakable. They had crossed from speculation into truth, and truth allowed no retreat. That afternoon, she declined an invitation that would have placed her again beside the younger brother. The refusal was polite, final, and noted. Word of it reached the Duke by evening, carried not by servants but by the attentive silence of society. He recognized the gesture as both protection and challenge. The choice she had demanded now pressed upon him with renewed urgency. That night, he reviewed ledgers and letters alike, measuring alliances against consequence. He imagined her absence from the season and found the prospect intolerable. What he could not yet imagine was compromise. Across the city, she prepared herself for withdrawal, sorting possessions that had never felt permanent. She told herself that survival did not require victory, only endurance. Yet beneath the discipline of reason stirred a hope she refused to name. It frightened her more than despair, for hope demanded response. The confession they shared now bound them to action, whether together or apart. Neither could return to the safety of misunderstanding. London, sensing resolution approaching, grew watchful. In drawing rooms and corridors, expectations rearranged themselves, anticipating either retreat or declaration. The Duke understood that delay would be interpreted as decision, and decision, once assumed, became irrevocable. She understood that waiting was a form of consent she was unwilling to give. Thus the ground shifted beneath them, narrowing the path ahead. Whatever came next would be public, irreversible, and defining. They stood on opposite sides of the same decision, aware that retreat would cost them more than advance. In that knowledge, anticipation sharpened into resolve. The season waited, patient and exacting, for a declaration worthy of its scrutiny. So did they, each counting the hours until restraint must finally give way to choice. Morning would demand answers, and neither intended to remain silent. With truth spoken and patience exhausted, the next act loomed, unavoidable and near. What form it would take depended not on society, but on the courage they were prepared to claim. Neither could delay it any longer. The declaration did not arrive with fanfare, but with inevitability, announced not by raised voices but by an invitation so deliberate it could not be misunderstood. The Duke requested her presence at a small afternoon gathering at his townhouse, one attended only by those whose opinions shaped rather than echoed society. She understood at once that retreat was no longer possible. To attend was to accept judgment, to refuse was to render it final. She chose attendance, dressing with care that spoke of self-command rather than display, and entered the house prepared to be measured. The room was quiet, arranged for conversation rather than performance, its restraint signaling seriousness of purpose. The Duke greeted her first, not as guardian nor supplicant, but as equal participant in a decision already made. His composure held, yet beneath it ran a current of resolve that altered his bearing. When the others arrived, he spoke plainly, acknowledging his intentions without flourish, naming her not as beneficiary of favor but as woman he esteemed. The words carried weight precisely because they were spare. In a society accustomed to euphemism, clarity felt revolutionary. Murmurs followed, contained but sharp, testing the firmness of his stance. He answered each inquiry with calm assurance, outlining provisions arranged with legality rather than defiance. He spoke of settlements, not sentiment, of responsibility assumed rather than avoided. In doing so, he reframed the narrative that had threatened her, transforming curiosity into respect by denying its spectacle. She remained silent, her presence steady, allowing his actions to speak where her defense never could. When the gathering ended, the judgment was not unanimous, but it was sufficient. Doors that might have closed remained open, if cautiously. The Duke escorted her to the carriage himself, an act both ordinary and irrevocable. In that simple gesture, witnessed and recorded, the season found its conclusion. Rumor dissolved into acceptance, not because doubt vanished, but because authority had been exercised without apology. The Duke's choice stood, and society, pragmatic as ever, adjusted its calculations. Later, in the quiet of the carriage, he spoke at last without witnesses. He did not promise ease or exemption from scrutiny, only partnership in its endurance. She answered with relief tempered by realism, accepting not a rescue but a shared burden. They understood each other then, not as romantic ideal but as deliberate alliance shaped by mutual respect. The affection between them, long restrained, found expression not in excess but in certainty. In the days that followed, London observed their union with measured curiosity. Invitations resumed, altered but sincere. She moved through rooms once hostile now neutral, her dignity intact. The younger brother withdrew with grace, relieved perhaps to relinquish a role he had never intended to fulfill. The Duke's household adjusted to her presence, discovering in her a quiet authority that required no assertion. Change came not with upheaval, but with gradual acceptance. One evening, weeks later, they stood together at a familiar Mayfair house, music rising once more beneath chandeliers. The memory of that first night hovered between them, no longer a wound but a marker of distance traveled. She laughed again, softly, without fear. The Duke watched her, not from across the room, but beside her, his expression unguarded at last. In choosing her openly, he had relinquished the safety of detachment and gained something less secure but infinitely more sustaining. The narrator of history might note the prudence of his arrangements, the legality of his declarations, the absence of scandal worthy of record. Yet such accounts would miss the true consequence of the moment, that two people, constrained by custom and circumstance, had insisted upon intention over convenience. Their story would not be celebrated as rebellion, but endured as example, quieter and more instructive for its restraint. As the season drew toward its close, London turned its attention elsewhere, satisfied that order had been preserved. What remained was a partnership founded not on illusion but on clarity hard-won. She retained her independence of thought, he his sense of duty, neither diminished by the other's presence. Together, they navigated a world that had tested them and found them equal to it. In years to come, the tale would be softened, simplified, rendered romantic in retrospect. The truth was less dramatic and more enduring. That dignity, once defended, could be shared, and that choice, when made openly, carried its own quiet triumph. The night ended as nights do, with carriages departing and candles guttering low, leaving behind a resolution unmarked by spectacle. They returned home not to escape the world, but to meet it altered, bound by decision rather than desire alone. The Duke, once defined by restraint, had learned its limits. She, once vulnerable to whisper, had claimed her place without surrender. Their future promised neither ease nor exemption, only the steady courage to proceed together. Thus concluded a story the season would never fully understand, and need not. For in a society built upon appearances, it was enough that something genuine had endured beneath them. The city slept, indifferent as ever, while within one household, choice had settled into permanence. The candles dimmed, the music faded, and history moved on, leaving behind not scandal, but certainty.